Welcome again to Educator. And for this lesson, we're going to learn about how to pigeonhole a book. This lesson assumes that you kind of already understand how to be a demanding reader and you're getting an idea of how to judge a book by its cover. This part is going to go over that in a little bit more detail. So, the overview will be this. We got to understand what kind of book it is. We have to understand more than is this a nonfiction or fiction book. Then we're going to learn what theoretical means and what practical means. And finally, we're going to go over the various kinds of books thought about and considered. Here is our first example, the Deathly Hallows Lectures. I've pigeonholed this book for you, and I'm going to pigeonhole it as a nonfiction book, a theoretical book, a book about literature, and it is a collection of lectures. And what's the topic all about? Our friend Harry Potter. Here's a much more complicated book. Well, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. This is definitely nonfiction. And it's not about science, believe it or not. It's about the philosophy of science. Definitely a theoretical book. This book is organized in a long series of arguments and has one overarching conclusion. And here's a third example. This is also nonfiction, and it's entitled How to Win Friends and Influence People. This one is a practical book. And what's it all about? It's about your charisma and your social skills. This book is full of anecdotes, it has examples, and it encourages habits, and it has several skills working together in order to win friends and influence people. So, what do I mean when I'm talking about pigeonholing a book? I'm just doing that, kind of picking out what the book's basically about, how it's organized, and whether or not it's theoretical or practical, which I'll be going over as a definition in a bit. Now, why do we pigeonhole though? Well, we got a couple reasons. Number one, we have to understand how to judge a book. I want you to imagine that you're reading through Amazon.com reviews and you read How to Win Friends and Influence People, which is a practical book that is set up like this. Dale Carnegie sets out to explain universal laws in which people develop friendships. Sadly, he clearly lacks scientific rigor. Each chapter concludes with an alleged scientific law, yet there is no mention of controlled experiments, peer-reviewed journal articles, or even so much as a trend. Dale Carnegie needs to go back to graduate school. Now, think back to How to Win Friends and Influence People. This is a practical book. This is a book that teaches you how to do something. So, is this book concerned about universal laws? No, it's not. So, this person has mispigeonholed the book, and he doesn't understand what it's all about, and so he can't judge it very well. Let's continue on. So, Thomas Kuhn, in telling the history of science, concentrates too much on the philosophical implications of ideas. A dry, objective telling of history must concentrate on personalities and their contributions. Yet Kuhn selectively chooses only a few examples and then proceeds to talk about abstract theories rather than concrete facts. This book is not recommended for any serious scholar of the history of science. Now, think back a couple slides. Was Thomas Kuhn's book about the history of science? No, it was about the philosophy of science. So again, if you mispigeonhole a book, you might write a silly Amazon.com review like this where you completely misunderstand it. Now, it is a theoretical book, a book that's all about ideas and facts and laws and things that you can't necessarily turn into action very easily. But it's not a history of science book. So, when we're judging a book, we have to understand that different books have different rules, not just how they're organized, but in how they're understood and how they're judged. So, again, we have to know that methodology of the writer before we understand a book. Now, methodology I'll be going over later, and I'll give you several examples of what you should expect to find in a book that's a literature book or a science book or a practical book, etc., etc. We'll go over that. So, number 2 reason to pigeonhole is that we have to understand what the author's goals are. Why did the author write this book? Well, a preface will tell us usually, because, they love talking about their own work, and they'll tell you what inspired them and what hopefully you can understand about the book and what's so important. And when we understand the author's goals, we do understand what's important to them and then what we can look for later in the book as we read through it in its entirety. We can also ask, and remember we ask this only after we think about the author, we ask what will you get out of the book? And then we also need to determine whether the book is theoretical or whether or not it's practical. So, now I'm going to get into a real solid definition of what theoretical versus practical means. I have 2 books here that are on the same subject, but one is theoretical and one is practical. I have a book called Influence by Dr. Robert Cialdini, who teaches at Arizona State University. I have a book here called Covert Persuasion by business consultant Kevin Hogan. Same subject, they're all about the psychology of persuasion. What makes people say yes to somebody else's demands? Influence by Robert Cialdini is full of scientific examples from the animal kingdom. And then he gives several documented, peer-reviewed articles about the results of sociological research. And then he gives you examples in history about how some of these persuasive laws have been applied in certain situations. And then he gives you a little bit of how to say no. Now, I would say that this book is a theoretical book. It's a book for, mostly academics, beard-stroking types, people who like to just kind of think. And then this guy is not really teaching you how to use these laws, but he wants to discover what these laws are and how they work. At the very end, he'll give you a tip on how to say no, but that's not the main meat of his book. He's discovering certain abstract laws, and he wants to explain them. That's all theoretical. Now, Kevin Hogan, on the other hand, kind of comes at you like Billy Mays. He's very excited. He's full of energy. He is not a beard-stroking academic. He's a guy in a suit with a flashy ring, and he's telling you all about what you can do if you read his book. How are you going to get a date? Maybe you're running a business and you need to sell more widgets. Maybe you're working with some other people and you need to communicate better with your business partners. Or how about this? Have you ever eaten alone? Okay, this guy, Kevin Hogan, this is a practical book. It's got the same subject matter. He understands what those laws of persuasion are. But he's not concerned about proving abstract theory. He doesn't care. He's taking that abstract theory and he wants to teach people how to do certain things. So his book is a practical book. Now, some people might think that, practical books are just for academics, and popular books are always practical and they're for everyday people. You got either a big, thick book on psychology, which is theoretical, or you have Dr. Phil. Well, it's not just that way. You can have a very old book and books that are studied in college that could be practical or theoretical. And here's 2 examples. An essay concerning human understanding by John Locke is 100% theoretical. He's concerned about, what makes knowledge? Well, our minds are blank slates. So knowledge can't come from our minds. It has to come from experience. It has to come from things I see, things I read, things I touch. It can't come from my mind because my mind's a blank slate when I'm born. And he kind of goes on for a long time on that, because that's 100% theoretical. Well, here's another ancient book that's probably not popular. You're not going to hear on Dr. Phil. It's a book called Nicomachean Ethics. And this is a book by Aristotle that he wrote to his son. And he's saying, man, You know what, son? All people want to be happy. So let's think carefully about what makes us happy and what habits can we put into our lives that are going to develop us to becoming more happy individuals. And also, if there's something that's making us unhappy or it hurts us, we're going to call those vices, and we're going to figure out what those are, and we're going to figure out how to avoid them. Okay, this is a straight-up practical book. Now, it's got a lot of theory. Don't get me wrong. I read it, and it takes a long time. But it is definitely practical. How to live your life, how to be happy. That's what Nicomachean Ethics is all about. Now, after looking at those two examples, you got beard-stroking academics, you got some guy telling you that your mind's a blank slate, and then you have, somebody coming at you like Billy Mays. Maybe you're thinking, well, why do we need to read theoretical books at all? Why does anybody communicate that way? That's just boring and useless. Not necessarily. People write theoretical and because of the demands of the genre. Many scientific textbooks are meant to be purely theoretical because they're going to teach you about how chemicals react, but they're not going to teach you how to make explosives in your bedroom. Sometimes the author just has a certain type of communication style where they're just better at explaining things theoretically. And that's how they communicate, and that's how they're built, and that's what I would call their pitching style. And, well, we just have to learn to adjust to catch it. Abstract subjects are still kind of important, and they're always going to be theoretical. That book, Philosophy of Science, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, is very abstract, but it does have eventually practical application if you read through it and understand the abstract stuff well enough. Also, and this one is very, very important, especially in areas of sociology and anthropology, an author might want to avoid moral judgment on something that he's reading or studying. So, for instance, when an anthropologist goes to another culture and they see that their customs on marriage are just abhorrent, and we just look at how they get people married, and we have, people getting married when they're 13 and it's arranged marriage by their parents, and we're kind of shocked by that, and we just think that's not okay. Well, somebody who's very theoretical is going to take a step back, and they're going to avoid moral judgment, and they're not going to explain what people should be doing because that'd be practical and moral. So they'll just be theoretical to avoid moral judgment, to really understand what's happening. Now, when we get to practical stuff, we are eventually going to apply knowledge. I mean, after all, good action is the result of good thinking. Practical books are almost always easier to learn, and they're easier to pick up, and they have lots of fun anecdotes, and they're really great to read. They are definitely intended to instruct you, and you will be learning something, and you're probably also being persuaded. Now, practical books often assume a moral judgment. They assume that the things that you think are good and right are the same things the author thinks are good and right. So practical books can almost never avoid moral judgment. It's just kind of how it is. Now we're going to be going over specific types of nonfiction books and give you a little bit of the methodology to understand them and evaluate them. So, if you're reading a book about science, the methodology is going to be empirical evidence, stuff you can see, stuff you can touch, and above all, stuff you can repeat. It's got to have some observation too, because how can I observe something and not be empirical at the same time? Those are kind of two sides of the same coin. If you remember what the scientific method is, make sure that you understand that before you read a science textbook. Science books can be theoretical or they can be practical, but they tend to be mostly this. Science books are mostly theoretical. There's going to be a lot of use of reason and logic, and you will almost never hear rhetoric in a science textbook. Rhetoric, again, is something I went over in the writing section, so refer to that if you're not sure what rhetoric is. History books. Well, the methodology for a history book is, well, people tend to look through historical records, old people's letters, books written by people during the time period, maybe an old newspaper, or maybe it's gone really far in the past and we've dug up some archaeological finds and we found some fragment of a record of the rule of an Egyptian pharaoh from, thousands of years ago. Perhaps there's an oral history written in, spoken in chronicles that the historian is going to look at and take into account. Maybe we're going to do that. But there's not going to be a lot of repeated experiments because, well, this is history, and history only comes once, and then it repeats itself. You get the idea. History books are often written in a nice narrative flowing form. And that's kind of nice because it's a little bit more like fiction reading. And you can kind of judge a history book by how well it tells a story. But, it's not necessarily going to be a nice 3-act story like we're used to, but it will be kind of a narrative of maybe a person's life or what's happening in France right before the French Revolution, all kinds of stuff. History books are generally theoretical. It would be hard to imagine a history book that could be applied very quickly and teach you how to do something. But it is possible. History books, you have to be aware, the author might be arguing a point. And chances are they're not arguing a point about something that happened in the past and why their view of history is the best one. They could actually be looking at the past and looking at the present and saying, hey, we need to make some changes right now so we don't repeat this mistake. Or, hey, look at our past and look at what we've done before. I bet we could do something great again if we did these things we did in the past. So please be aware of that when you're reading a history book. There's a little bit of rhetoric there. Political books. Political books are a combination of many disciplines, and that would include several different methodologies. Sometimes makes them a little tricky to read. So they might use science. So maybe you're going to be reading some statistics, some empirical observation, all kinds of things that might be proving the author's point. Maybe they're looking back into history for their political viewpoint to give support to what they want you to believe. And they're going to look at history to prove that. Maybe there's a difference in principle. Maybe we're going to talk about what really makes human rights important and why that's more important than people who say that humans really don't have rights. Perhaps they're going to be using some abstract theoretical philosophy to prove that. Political books can be theoretical or practical, but most of the popular political books tend to be practical because they want you to vote a certain way and to think a certain way. They're trying to persuade you to a point and eventually to some kind of political action. So, and again, generally the author has an axe to grind, so to speak. He has a political belief that he wants you to share too. And he's going to explain to you why his is the best one. Finally, we got literature, which is like the book I mentioned previously. Literature books rely on what's called hermeneutics. Now, hermeneutics is an entirely different subject and some that could be spent another entire educator.com class on. But for now, hermeneutics just means interpretation of any written work. Hermeneutics is a big fancy word for interpretation of any written work. Different genres of literature have different hermeneutics. I don't interpret poetry the same way I interpret fiction, and I don't interpret a fiction book the same way I would interpret the Bible. Different hermeneutics for different books. A book that is commenting on literature can be theoretical or practical. This book is just kind of all about theory. It's about getting the deeper meaning and deeper ideas out of one of the Harry Potter books. That's all theoretical. But what if I read another book, that was entitled How to Create Great Fiction Characters? How in there is giving me an idea that this is a practical book. And he's not going to spend time analyzing characters that other people have created, but he intends to help his readers create fiction characters of their own. Yet they're both literature books. So, your assignment is to go to the library again and to judge a book by its cover. Look at the back cover, look at the front cover, take some notes, and look at the table of contents. Make sure you read all the way the author's preface. And then, in 250 words or 350 words, write a response answering these 3 questions. Is this book a practical book or a theoretical book? What is the book's subject matter? Is it a literature book? Is it a science book? Is it all about Harry Potter? Is it all about how to read other books? Finally, why does the author think it's important? Go to a library or go to a bookstore or find anywhere where you can get your hands on some nonfiction and do that for not 1, but 3 different books. So you'll probably be writing about 1,000 words. But I'm sure that won't be too much of a problem. So, until you've done that, go ahead and just enjoy reading and be sure to come back for the next lesson at educator.com.